Dame Nicola, Simon, Michael, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to UCL this morning. Just before I do what I'm supposed to do, I just wanted to say that that was a brilliant introduction, Simon, and real summary of everything that we're facing. And those of you who are from UCL, I just encourage you to go away and read the front page again of UCL 2034 against the background of what Michael said, and I think you'll see how it all fits together. My job this morning is to say a few words about the lecture itself and how it came about, and then to introduce our speaker. So welcome to everybody to the 2018 Burton R. Clark Lecture on Higher Education. This lecture was established at the UCL Institute of Education in memory of the late Professor Burton, affectionately known as Bob Clark, a distinguished sociologist of higher education who sadly passed away in 2009. Bob Clark worked at Stanford, Harvard, Berkeley, Yale, and for much of his career he was at UCLA as the Alan M. Carter Professor of Higher Education. He is considered to be the United States' leading scholar in the field of higher education studies. He made notable contributions to the comparative understanding of higher education, especially in his best-known book, The Higher Education System, which was published as far back as 1983, and another book, Creating Entrepreneurial Universities, which was published in 1998. He developed the ideas that continue to shape the outlook of graduate students and university leaders across the world. He often visited and worked in the UK, and he had many friends and colleagues in this country, which he valued for its universities and its university traditions of autonomy and freedom of inquiry. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank his widow, Adele Clark, for her generous donation to the UCL Institute of Education, which established this lecture series. We're very honoured to host this lecture series. This is the third such lecture. The first two lecturers were Bob Clark's former doctoral student, Professor Gary Rhodes from the University of Arizona, and Professor Ellen Hazelcorn last year from the Dublin Institute of Technology. Let me turn now to introduce today's distinguished speaker. So Michael Ignatieff is a university professor, a writer, and a former politician. As you all know, he is currently the rector and president of the Central European University in Budapest. And Michael, we are very deeply honoured to have you here speaking to us. His major publications include The Needs of Strangers, 1984, Scar Tissue, 1992, Isaiah Berlin, 1998, The Rights Revolution, 2000, Human Rights as Politics and Idolatry, 2001, The Lesser Evil, Political Ethics in an Age of Terror, 2004, and Fire and Ashes, Success and Failure in Politics. What an incredible track record of publications. But in addition to that, between 2006 and 2011, he served as an MP in the Parliament of Canada, and then as leader of the Liberal Party of Canada and leader of the official opposition. He is a member of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada, and he holds currently 11 honorary degrees. Between 2012 and 2015, he served as the Centennial Chair at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs in New York. And between 2014 and 2016, he was the Edward R. Murrow Professor of the Practice of the Press, Politics and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Michael, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to UCL and invite you now to give your lecture with the wonderful title, Academic Freedom and the Future of Europe.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Can I be heard at the back? Is this thing working? Okay, I have nods. Great, terrific. It's an honor to give the Burton R. Clark Lecture. I thank his widow. I thank UCL for thinking of inviting me. People here seem to remember a dim and distant past when I was on British television, and they're all thinking, God, he's aged. Oh, terrible. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to do a couple of things. I want to tell you a story, the liberal story of the globalization of higher education, and then I'm going to tell you a story about the authoritarian turn in higher education, and then I'm going to try and fit the CEU story into both of those. CEU is part of the liberal globalization wave of higher education and is now caught in the turmoil of the authoritarian turn. And my message about CEU is slightly like Leonard Cohen's wonderful song, I've seen the future and it is murder. So just to keep you cheerful, right? Let me start with the liberal narrative. Really between 1989 and 2015, as Professor Marginson has so eloquently described, there's a surge of globalization in higher education, and he's set the frame in the right way. I want to focus on just some pieces of that, which is, from an American point of view, particularly American leadership was crucial here, the surge in the creation of overseas campuses. Suddenly it seemed as if every American university had a campus overseas. In this period between 1989 and 2015, every smart university seemed to want to do a joint degree with another institution. So you begin to get flow through a semester here, a semester there. We globalize student recruitment in an astonishing way. When I go through the halls of the University of Toronto, where I graduated in 1965, and go through the law school, I see in the graduation photographs white males to an astounding degree in 1965. Cut forward to 2015, the same hallowed halls have a diversity, which is an enormous human achievement and an enormous benefit. Globalization meant we simply changed the composition of the student body. And that globalization of student recruitment, as Professor Marginson's pointed out, was dependent, although we didn't quite look at changes inside the society that allowed for the creation of multicultural societies in Canada, the United States, and Europe, very much from 1965 onwards, but also depended on visa regimes which allowed universities to attract students from around the world. While we globalized student recruitment, we also obviously globalized faculty recruitment. Again, if you look at a picture of a history department in a North America, my degree is in history, you saw a certain profile that by 2015, you simply have the world teaching the world in a way that seems an extraordinary social achievement, with the consequence that universities became among the most diverse, among the most multicultural, among the most plural of all the global communities. So that's the liberal achievement in the globalization of higher education. It's worth noting that some of this was accompanied by a certain kind of pact with authoritarians that aroused discomfort at the time. Example, the Schwarzman program at Tsinghua in Beijing. You want to create a free scholarship program for American and other students. The Schwarzman students I've seen operate in a curious bubble in which they have free internet access, but their same Chinese students in the same classes do not have equal internet access. So globalization involved getting into bed with certain regimes and making deals in which Western-style academic freedom met very, very adverse authoritarian contexts and tried to make a marriage that would work. Beijing would be one example. Abu Dhabi, NYU Abu Dhabi would be another. NYU would tell you they are perfectly free to teach what they want in Abu Dhabi. Complicated story, it seems to me. Similar example, the European University in St. Petersburg is a creature of this liberal period of globalization. It sets up in St. Petersburg and finds itself in a very uneasy relationship with the authoritarian, emerging authoritarianism of Yeltsin and Putin's Russia in the 1990s. But we thought, I think, in each of these cases, that a kind of liberal academic freedom could go into authoritarian contexts and work something out and push and widen the scope of academic freedom in closed societies. Universities were therefore a kind of battering ram in which liberal democracy would implant itself in these societies. Academic freedom would then play a part in opening these societies up. This may have been a deep illusion, but that is, I think, the kind of thing we thought. Let me give you the example of CEU. CEU is founded in 1991 by a bunch of Hungarian and Eastern European academics in Budapest and in Prague. The idea was to implant high-quality, world-class social science and humanities teaching in university systems that had only known communist ideology. Universities were called Karl Marx University, and you can imagine what the social science curriculum in Karl Marx University was. So what do you do if you've got Karl Marx University? You create Central European University and you teach Western, Weberian, Durkheimian social science, and you then train a cadre of people who will then spread the virtues of Western academic freedom to the whole of the post-communist world. And there you see academic freedom is playing a crucial role in the whole transition process from communism to liberal market democracy. We were going to train the transition elite. That was what CEU was supposed to do. We're US accredited and Hungarian accredited with an open society mission. What did an open society mission? It didn't mean propaganda, but it did mean open minds, open thinking, free minds, free institutions, and free politics. And from 1991, perhaps until 2010, that mission seemed to us to be working. But it had some unexpected results, which I should draw to your attention. One of the unexpected effects of mobility was that as soon as Eastern European, the 4 Eastern European countries got entry into the European Union, any bright Eastern European student who could went to London, went to Paris, went to Berlin. Schengen and EU accession had an enormous brain drain effect on the local elites. We came to teach those elites the values of an open society and found that the elites had left to come and study here. So we began to globalize our recruitment, and we now recruit from 120 countries. The largest cohort at CEU in applications for 2018 were from Pakistan and Ghana, right? Not from the Czech Republic or Poland or... The other fact about Eastern Europe has been the plunging demographic profile of these societies. The university-eligible cohort for admission is falling rapidly in this part of the world, and those who can learn are going west and not coming back. There's a complicated sense in which the mobility story that we're very proud of has had some perverse effects. That's what I'm trying to bring home to you, and maybe triggering some of the resentment about the impact of university education on Eastern Europe that we need to think about. I think another aspect of the globalization, the liberal globalization story, is that we globalized our student recruitment, and we globalized our faculty, and we didn't globalize the curriculum. We basically taught Western North Atlantic social science to a lot of eager people from other societies, but did we actually begin to globalize curriculum? We taught human rights in Myanmar from the outside. Did we teach human rights in Myanmar from the Myanmar side of the story? As controversial and difficult as that is, not so much. Globalization was very much from here to there, not in a pedagogical dialogue that changed our curriculums. And I would say now that as a university leader, that's one of the biggest challenges of globalization. We've globalized faculty, we've globalized students, we haven't even begun to think about what it would mean to have a global curriculum. What we didn't see coming at CU, this is self-criticism, is we trained the transition elite, a liberal democratic transition elite, but we trained the elite that lost politically, right? Interesting story. That's one of the ways to interpret what just happened. They had an election in Hungary, and the transition elite, the liberal democratic elite post-1989, got pulverized, and a new national bourgeoisie, center-right, conservative, religious, Christian, anti-migration won. And we are now facing all the consequences of having trained an elite that lost. So that's something about the liberal globalization story and some of its unintended results. Let me now turn to the authoritarian turn in higher education and tell you a story about that, some of which will be very familiar to you. But if you look at Russia, China, Turkey, Hungary, you begin to see a new pattern that we need to understand. In Russia, I mentioned earlier the European University of St. Petersburg, very fine social science, humanities university in Petersburg, set up again to train a liberal elite that now is in a death spiral because of the pressure of the Petersburg counter elites, the people who want to get hold of their real estate, the municipal officials who arrive in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of classes, and say, I see you have a problem with your fire doors. We're going to have to close you for 8 weeks while you get fire doors. This is a true story. This is how it gets done. This is how universities get shut. They suddenly look around and discover, we'll invent a problem with your fire code, and it'll take you 8 weeks to fix it. Interrupt the studies, make it impossible for people to have continuity in their academic performance. That's what's happening to European University St. Petersburg. They don't actually close you down. They just chip away relentlessly at your capacity to operate at all. So that's Russia. So here's the paradox in Russia, where we appear to be reverting to a pattern which was discernible in Sakharov's time, in the Soviet time. Certain amounts of academic freedom and openness to the international scientific community for the natural sciences. Total control in social sciences and humanities. We seem to be going back to that pattern in Russia. Globalization in China, this seems to me one of the most momentous stories in global higher education. It's not one where I'm an expert, but the degree of ideological regimentation and control in social science and humanities in China is a sign of what Xi Jinping has in mind for the entire society. It seems to me they have concluded that they cannot afford free institutions teaching social sciences and humanities freely in China because it's essentially a regime threat, ultimately. It's not, there's no other way to interpret what they're doing. Academic freedom is a regime threat. I think the liberal transition story we believed was that we would move from liberalization of the market to inevitable liberalization of thought, to a inevitable liberalization of politics. Xi Jinping's decision to become emperor for life is a clear signal right down the chain that academic life in China will be very, very heavily policed. And the place where the Chinese community will have open access will be in the natural science domains crucial to economic growth and innovation, and they will seek, whether this is a stable bargain, we don't know, to keep the control with a limited opening in STEM subjects. The other obvious place you know is Turkey, and there it's absolutely brutal. We've had a surge of applicants from Turkey coming to CEU simply because anybody who can get out of Turkish social science and humanities is doing so. We need to be aware this is happening a couple of hours flying time from this room. Whole faculties being dismissed. Students of mine, students at Harvard who took my classes are being arrested as Gulenists and put on trial. If you don't know about this, look it up, find it out. This is one of the biggest scandals about academic freedom in our part of the world. And it seems to me it is being sustained by something else that we need to face clearly, which is that Europe is not engaging with Mr. Erdogan on the issue of academic freedom because Mr. Erdogan is controlling the taps on migration flows into Europe. It's an absolutely diabolic bargain in which the freedom of Turkish institutions is being traded against migration control. And it's one of the basic institutional political reasons why European leaders, European instances, European voices that could speak out are notably silent about the restriction of academic freedom in Turkey. If you look at the Turkish story, the Chinese story, the Russian story, and the Hungarian story, I think what you see is a very clear emerging picture that single-party regimes, and this is what they are everywhere privileging control because they see academic freedom as a regime threat. They're privileging control over academic quality and openness to international academic life. If they have to choose what they want, which is universities under their thumb or universities that actually open into the world, contribute academic knowledge, exchange freely or integrated into the networks that Dr. Marginson was describing. If they have to choose between having good universities and universities they control, they choose universities they control every time. It's depressing, but that seems to me what we need to look at. Let me now take you a little bit through the CEU story. This is not an attempt for you to feel my pain. It's interesting. I'm not discouraged by it, but I think it's a kind of interesting story from which we can all learn some lessons. A year ago, without any consultation or warning, the Orban government introduced a thing called Lex CEU, which said, here are the new rules for higher education for international institutions in Hungary. You have to have an agreement with us before you can operate. You have to have an agreement between us and the state in which you originate. The United States in our case, because we're accredited in the United States. Secondly, you can't operate here unless you have a campus in the United States. For 30 years, 25 years, we've been operating in Hungary without a campus in the United States. Some people find that odd, but In fact, there are 30 US institutions overseas that operate without a US campus. Think American University Beirut, American University Cairo. We're actually a typical member of a set. So suddenly we had to have a campus. Suddenly we had to have a new bilateral agreement with the government. Suddenly we weren't allowed to have a dual, this gets complicated, a dual legal and American identity. Basically that meant you can't issue American accredited degrees in Hungary because, here's an interesting aspect of the story, the local Hungarian universities were jealous of the fact that we could award US masters and PhDs. It's our carte de visite, it's our competitive advantage. And a national bourgeoisie supported by the state wants to, quote, level the playing field. Level the playing field is code for we want to remove your capacity to issue internationally accredited degrees. So that was the legislation dropped on us without warning, without consultation, without precedent. As you know, we then said basically hell no. And I think that's something to say, particularly for members of the international audience who work in difficult contexts. One of the institutional dispositions of universities is to be very quiet, thoughtful, avoid conflict, avoid standing up. Our lesson is sometimes you got to fight, by which I mean you've got to raise the price for the other side. If they won't talk to you, if you can't engage in dialogue, if quietly won't go, you better put some troops on the ground. And so we rallied our network. Remember how networked universities are. We have huge networks of alumni. We have huge networks of academic colleagues in every university in Europe. We have friends. We mobilize those. One student put a Facebook call out on a Friday afternoon, and we had 75,000 people in the streets of Budapest chanting free universities in a free country. You have to be made of stone not to be moved by that. And we had nothing to do with it. So what's the message of that? Universities should not underestimate their public support. They should not underestimate the power of their networks. And there are occasions, if you get really pushed by a government, when standing up can raise the price for the other side. This is politics. You sometimes have to fight a political battle to defend academic freedom. And these were some of the things we learned. The consequence is that the government then agreed very reluctantly to go into negotiations with the state of New York, where we're accredited. By the end of last summer, we got a deal which would allow us to stay in Budapest. In return, we would establish educational activities in the United States. It makes sense to compromise, so we compromised. And for 9 months, we've been sitting there waiting for the government of Hungary to sign this agreement. Last Monday, as you know, they just won a thumping 2/3 majority. He now holds all the cards, and I'm standing here not able to tell you whether he will or will not sign the deal that would allow us to stay in Budapest. And if we can't stay in Budapest, I will have to move an entire university across a European frontier to a European state where they can't screw us around. Excuse my language, I feel a little emotional about this subject. So that's where we are. And what can I tell you are some of the more general lessons to draw here? One of the things that, this is a candid confession from a university president, but until we got into this jam, I never really thought that hard about academic freedom. I kind of took it for granted. Or if you pressed me, I thought it's kind of a privilege of professors. It just means they can't fire you. I mention this because I think a lot of people in the general public think of academic freedom that way. It's a privilege of professors. It's one of those little perks that middle-class educated people get to have. You know, they can fire us, but they can't seem to fire the professors. That's what academic freedom is. I take you here because we have to be, as people who love and care about higher education, we need to be very clear about how we are seen. We need to turn the language of academic freedom is our privilege into academic freedom is a right that protects us all, right? It's the key move we all have to make if we're going to defend universities in the 21st century. We are not just fighting for a corporate privilege for ourselves. We are defending a countermajoritarian institution whose function is to serve and protect and defend the whole society's capacity to know anything at all, right? That's why academic freedom matters. If we defend it as a corporate privilege, we're done for. And that's one thing, a central message I've learned. The second message, I've already called universities a counter-majoritarian institution. And my point here is that we need to understand the crucial way in which academic freedom is one element of a counter-majoritarian fabric that is integral to the health of a democratic society. If you're a university president, you ask yourself, what do I need institutionally to make sure that academic freedom in my institution is secure? Here's a rough checklist, right? You need rule of law and constitutional review. You need independent accreditation bodies that can accredit a university without political pressure. You need self-governing professional associations, scientific bodies that are able to do independent peer review. If you're a university, you need to have informal rights of consultation about pending legislation. You need to be able to take for granted as a university president that if they change the rules of the game, the education authorities will call you in and say, here's what we propose to do, what do you think about it, right? We never think about that as crucial to academic freedom, but believe me, when you've been subjected to a legal process in which you had no rights of consultation, you suddenly are apprised of how important rights of consultation are. Parliamentary review of higher education legislation turns out to be critically important. The higher education law that is threatening us was put through Parliament in 6 days, signed by the President in 12, right? No parliamentary review of higher education legislation. That's another thing you need. You also need a free press. The universities are, at the moment, the UK chancellors I know are getting beaten up for their expense accounts and their salaries and this and that. And the Daily Mail is always running nasty stories about how privileged and entitled and spoiled you are, and running stories about how ridiculous the pension disputes in universities are. But believe me, if you don't have a free press, you're in much worse trouble, right? So understand the deep integral relationship between a free press and academic freedom. And then, needless to say, you have to have statutory guarantees of university autonomy and self-government. Universities are among the oldest self-governing institutions in the world. Courts, parliament, everybody has to acknowledge, respect those charters of independence and autonomy. You need to have the capacity to set your own budgets independently. And above all, you need to be part of an international structure of independent scientific peer review. And the final thing that Professor Marginson adds, which must be part of it, again, we've not thought about this in the liberal globalization of higher education. Depoliticized visa access. Visa regimes are now the chief choke point in every Western democratic country, restricting the capacity of universities to freely choose who they want to admit to their programs. It's a huge issue in the United States. It could be a huge issue in Britain. Weirdly and oddly, it's not an issue in Hungary. We got every problem in the world with the government, but they don't sit there and say, oh, you can't have a Yemeni, or you can't have a Pakistani. I'm waiting for, I don't want to give them any hints, I hope you're not listening. But I would have to say we have not had the kind of visa, the politicized, securitized visa control that could bedevil the future of higher education in Britain, and is definitely bedeviling the future of higher education in the United States. I mean, what we live in is a system in which there is not rule of law, but rule by law. The rule of constant changing administrative discretion of a highly political kind. We have a party state that controls accreditation. We have a party state that regulates scientific bodies and determines who gets scientific grants. We have a government that's just secured a supermajority, and so that forecloses parliamentary scrutiny. We have a government-controlled media that drastically restricts our capacity to tell our story to the public. Every Hungarian institution has intense budgetary control by the state through a chancellor system. One of the consequences is that Hungarian higher education, which has an extraordinarily important historic record. I mean, Hungary produces some of the greatest mathematicians and natural scientists in the world. They are looking at declining real levels of investment in higher education for the last 4 or 5 years. These regimes want to underinvest in higher education because basically higher education is the source of political challenge to the regimes. So they rather starve these institutions than feed them. This is the real world of the authoritarian turn in higher education. And one other point, these regimes, and I'm thinking Turkey, I'm thinking China, I'm thinking Russia, and I'm thinking Hungary, are increasingly creating what they call national universities to teach public administration. So that basically, instead of having your future bureaucracy trained in free institutions, you have them trained in administrative schools that tightly control and ideologically form the entire apparatus of the state. And this is another challenge to academic freedom. Why do these maneuvers, why does this strategy of national higher education, the authoritarian strategy in higher education, have any support? I think what I've learned is that it has support from local universities who resent international competition. All of these regimes are trying to create what used to be called a national bourgeoisie, that is dependent on state subsidies, state support, state contracts, state education. So these are regimes that use education to create a national bourgeoisie, which will in turn support them to the degree that they depend on elections at all. And this electoral base, certainly in Hungary, I think in other countries, potentially in Poland, supports this kind of regime control because it's also connected with migration control. They do not want a multicultural, pluralist demographic future. So the control of universities is part of an attempt to re-engineer these societies and redefend them as mono-ethnic societies controlled by their own state-supported national bourgeoisie. So where do we go from here? I've been unrelievedly gloomy. You will want me to give you some sense of, I'm trying to, one of my old good friends who survived the Holocaust in Hungary. I once asked him about how he faced life, and he said, some people believe in hope and redemption and optimism. He said, I'm a pretty strong believer in brute reality. And I think that's kind of my message. There's nothing inherently discouraging about this, provided you look it squarely in the eye and see what you're looking at and not be deceived. What do I see? I see academic freedom is a core European value. And it's a core European value because universities need to think of themselves as countermajoritarian institutions, as integral to the survival of free societies, as a free press, an independent judiciary, peer review, parliamentary review of legislation. We're part of an intricate structure of counter-majoritarian freedom. And our political challenge is, in a period in which democracy is equated with majoritarianism, it's a very tough sell to tell people that your freedom as a people, as a nation, as a majority, absolutely depends on you having institutions that say you may be wrong. It's the toughest sell of all. Obviously, universities have to serve the publics that pay our bills. And I think we do a pretty good job at serving those public. The more difficult message we have to pass is that a free press keeps the channels of information open so that citizens can deliberate. Courts make sure that legislation is consistent with constitutional and rights safeguards. Universities are there to do the one thing they absolutely have to do, which is winnow the hard facts of knowledge from the chaff of opinion, rumor, fantasy, paranoia, tweets, blogs, and the whole deluge of false information, which makes it almost impossible for our societies to deliberate freely on the basis of what we actually know to be true. That's what universities are actually for. And what they have to do is train students that knowledge is extremely hard. It's a discipline. We use the word discipline. It's a discipline you have to follow, and once you've got it, you have access to the most important thing a democratic citizen has to have, which is the capacity to find out what is true, right? That's our job. But it's an unpopular job. It's a job that people may not want to hear. It's a job the Daily Mail definitely doesn't want to hear, but it's our job, and we have to defend it with courage and without any embarrassment that sometimes this will be counter-majoritarian in its impact. I do not, as I look at the future of CEU, I have a number of concerns. You guys are walking out the door. Most of you don't want to walk out the door of Europe, but you're gone. I would love to have much more support from British academic institutions, saying loud and clear, an attack on academic freedom anywhere in Europe is an attack on our academic freedom. I've had some magnificent support from UK universities, but I fear the inertial effect of Brexit is to make British universities think, well, we got to cope with our own. Our European duties of solidarity don't matter anymore. Please don't think that. We really need to hear from the great European universities that happen to be in the United Kingdom. You have the best universities in Europe. They are listened to. Please speak if the government of Hungary decides to close us down. People ask me, should we look to European institutions? The European Commission has been helpful. The European Parliament wraps him on the knuckles. But I do not expect European institutions to raise the price of throwing us out so high that he won't do it. I do think what it will turn on is whether internally this turns out to be sufficiently unpopular with inside his own party that he will turn back at the last moment. And yours truly will do his very best to make sure that this university remains in Budapest, because it focuses our vocation so clearly. If you're in the front line of a battle to defend any kind of liberal freedom in a place, it has the wonderful effect of reminding you what the hell universities are actually for. And it's invigorating, it's challenging, it's slightly frightening, but I hope you come out of what I've heard more energized in your commitment to what you do, because this is a moment in which we really, really have to believe in what we do. Thank you very much.
stunning, slightly frightening. Absolutely, I was blown away by that. You put in front of us, Professor Ignatieff, some difficult and uncomfortable truths. You've set out powerful lessons from the story of CEU. You've re-expressed in an incredibly powerful way what academic freedom really means. You've told us that universities have got a real job to do and that it's a really unpopular job. I'm hoping now that we're going to have lots of questions from the audience. I certainly know that as I was listening to you, instead of thinking about my questions, I was just rapt by what you were saying. So I'm hoping that others in the audience have got time, had time in their own minds to think of some questions. Shall we take them perhaps in groups of 3?
Yes, that'd be great.
So please, we have a question here, one over there, and then one behind a lady in a red jacket.
Paul Ashwin from CGHE at Lancaster University. Thanks for that. It was very challenging. One thing I wondered was that part of the narrative you gave, another interpretation of that, is it's really about an academic elite who hadn't engaged with the societies that their privileged are based upon. And actually, that separation of universities from the societies in which they work and making that knowledge more available to those societies, to me, seemed to be one of the lessons. And actually, one of the things to think about is not just what higher education needs from society, but actually what higher education does for society.
Thank you. Gentleman in a blue shirt over here.
Thank you very much for the keynote, Miguel Lin from the University of Manchester. So it's also to deal with a recent interview that you had with the French radio station about your more concrete plans that you laid out about moving the university to Vienna, I think, if should things go wrong. Can you tell us a little bit more about what CEU won't and will be able to do from Vienna in terms of the mission that you were outlining? So how does it, you were mentioning about the university being on the front line. So obviously Vienna is not the front line in terms of Hungarian politics, but can you tell us a little bit about, do you really think of your political mission, what would CEU's role be if it were played from Vienna?
And the third in this round of questions, lady in the red jacket.
My name is Kaiyun and I'm from IOE. My question is about, I heard you said that you give 4 cases, Turkey, China, and Russia, and Hungary. And you said that the one-party system, political system, always chose the control of the institution over the academic freedom. I'm curious about how you come to this conclusion. Did you choose this kind of political system to see that they have this kind of similarities, or you have overviewed all the kind of political system and to see that come to this conclusion? And I would also like to, if you could illustrate more about the influence of other than the political influence on the academic freedom, for example, like the culture and maybe the religious influence. Thank you.
I'm glad they come in groups of 3 because you can buy a little time. They're excellent questions, which is what you say when you're trying to buy still more time. I think the first challenge, I'd agree with it 100%, and then I'd push back. My sense of British universities, under pressure from government and because in the conscience of those who work in universities a very strong feeling, there have been almost unlimited attempts to show British society how hard we work, how hard we seek to serve, to train, credential. Equally, some of your academics here have pointed out how incredibly unequal access to university education remains, how many British citizens of color, British citizens from lower social economic origins are simply not getting a shot at this, that there is a flagrant contradiction between a kind of egalitarian ideology and an extremely unequal practice. Universities are talking a game, and somehow the transforming impact of university education is still confined to exclude from lots of people. I think universities are actually deeply conscious of that and want to do more. When I talk to the super elite, to the Cambridge and Oxford, you don't need to put this on a, they get that message. I'm trying to say something different, which is that there are moments when we have to stand up and say, self-evidently we serve a society. Self-evidently we have to make the prize of university education available to everybody. Self-evidently we're failing. But let's also say something else. There are going to be a number of times when what professors say drive you crazy. There are going to be times when our social science conclusions will contradict everything that the Daily Mail is saying, everything that, the Labor Party is saying, everything that the Conservative Party is saying, and that is our job, right? Pushing back to defend the countermajoritarian space, which we need in order to serve the place well. That's why I'm putting an emphasis on that, because I think you can end up twisting yourself into a kind of ball of how can we serve? I'm so eager to help, how can we understand, we get all our budgets from you, bowing down in front of the majoritarian turn in politics. The majoritarian turn, by which I mean you have one referendum at one moment in time, and that decides for generations irrevocably the most important political decision you've made since 1945. That's what I mean by a majoritarian turn. And the consequence of that is then you, as universities, you say, oh yes, whatever the majority wants, we might, right? And you funnel that through with an egalitarian language, which makes it even worse. When what you also have to say is, we are going to say things you don't want to hear, and it's our damn job. In the same way that the attacks on the courts have seem to be scandalous in a country that actually invented the independence of the judiciary. Right? And again, this sense that we are the oldest self-governing institutions in the world. And we're proud of that. That sense of not defending corporate privilege, but defending the pride of being counter-majoritarian institutions is kind of what I'm trying to say. And this is said to you as a liberal egalitarian, right? I just think we sometimes get trapped by liberal egalitarianism into thinking, how can I be agreeable? What can I do to help, When sometimes you have to say, boom, no, wrong, right? You know what I mean? All right, that's Vienna. We've decided that we need a satellite campus in Vienna because there are things we can do in Vienna, which is a great international city, which we can't do in Budapest. I don't want to move the entire operation to Vienna at all. A, because it's a logistical nightmare. B, because it's an admission of defeat. A university that is there to defend free minds and free institutions should not be pushed out of a country by a regime. And so we're trying to find a way to stay. And I think under any circumstances, we'll continue to maintain programs and activity in Budapest. But I need to go to Vienna to hedge my political risk, number one, and number two, give students opportunities they wouldn't have in Budapest. So that's where we are on Vienna. The question implicitly about China is the most difficult because I stood up and pontificated as if I was a world expert on Chinese higher education, and you probably know more, I would imagine, about Chinese education in your little finger than I know my whole body. But I do think, I'm trying to chart a moment in which I think has passed, in which every great university in the world in the liberal democratic West wanted to have a partnership in China. Because you've got some great universities and fantastic students and whatever. And I think we're discovering that the conditions of entry and the conditions of collaboration have more implications for academic freedom than we imagine. I'm not saying this story is over, because the other part of the story I haven't mentioned at all is, I'm now going to give you a government health warning. I sometimes cite figures and they may just be wrong. But I've heard a number dating back a couple of years, that there are like 280,000 Chinese citizens studying in the United States. That's another aspect of this, in which what happens when those folks go home? And they go home to societies that are much more regulated than they were used to. This is an old story going back to the 19th century. You know, Russian students would come to the West, and it began a long process of fermentation that had ultimately destabilizing effects on the authoritarian regimes of the 19th century. Will this happen in the Chinese case? What I'm suggesting is that the regime bargain, this is a hypothesis, it may be wrong, the regime bargain that you can manage a limited opening in the natural sciences while clamping down in the social sciences and humanities, and you can have relationships with Western universities that you can control. This is an unstable bargain. I just don't know whether the Chinese are going to be able to manage this into the future. And then add on to it the number of international Chinese students coming home and, say, getting an academic job that is much more constrained than the one they were used to in the West. This is an unstable set of problems, and I don't underestimate the capacity of the Chinese regime to manage this successfully, but it's a bit of a handful. That's, I think, all I would want to say.
Okay, I'm going to take another 3 questions in a minute, and I know there are lots of hands up, but in a counter-majoritarian spirit, I'm going to do something that chairs of Q&A sessions aren't meant to do, and I'm going to comment on that last question, because I lived between 2009 and 2013 in South Africa, and the question, the lady in the red jacket was asking whether you, Michael, had just been focusing on one-party states. I think that tendency to equate democracy with majoritarianism, whether you come from a one-party state or whether you come from a liberation party background like in South Africa, or indeed in a two-party generally state in the UK, I think that temptation of a party in power to equate democracy with majoritarianism is there everywhere. And I watched that fight happening in South Africa, and I think that the new president there probably signals a sense that the equation between democracy and majoritarianism is not fixed, that you can fight back, but it's a hard struggle. 3 more questions. There were 2 over there, a lady with a black jacket and cardigan and a cream one behind, and a gentleman at the back with a blue shirt and a grey beard, if I may say that.
Rajni Naidu, International Centre for Higher Education Management, University of Bonn. 1 plea and 1 question. And plea is that both myself and all my British colleagues take inspiration from your message. We are faced with huge numbers of regulation and different types of governance that we know are completely wrong. We know that it will actually erode equity, it erodes quality, it creates a very dysfunctional system of higher education. We write about it, we write critically about it, but we do very little else. So it's a plea to all of us, but also to Universities UK, to actually come together and to stand up and oppose some of the things that we know are clearly wrong in our own society. Secondly, a question for you. I grew up in a generation which really valued academic freedom and fought for academic freedom. Young people now, this generation of university students, are very much engaged in no-platform debates where certain speakers who are fascist, who are right-wing, are not allowed onto campus. And I wonder if you could comment on that, please.
Thank you. The lady behind in cream.
Claudia Steinberg from the UCL European Institute. I would like to pick up on what you said about the ambition and the challenge also to root universities in their societies. And I would like to ask for your thoughts on how much CEU is actually rooted in the Hungarian society. It stands as a beacon of academic freedom just because of what's happened. But I wonder how this body of international students and international academics actually manages to fight the quest for establishing facts and truth in a society and I know that some of your professors are excellent at that, but I wonder how much you as an institution commit to this and how you go about it. The protests of the 75,000 definitely show that you seem to be doing something right.
And the gentleman in the blue shirt at the back. In the interest of equity, I will look at this half of the room for the next round of questions.
I'm in the middle position then. Thank you for that very moving speech, which confirmed so much. My name is Gordon Redding, and I'm from the University of Hong Kong. So you can tell from where I'm standing. One of the unassailable facts, as a historian you'll be sensitive to, is that no totalitarian state has ever yet broken through to a modern condition of high income per capita, egalitarianism, freedom of speech. The reason for this, I suggest, is that there are two great momentums in society. One is innovativeness, and the other is cooperativeness. Now, totalitarian states can handle innovativeness by stealing it and borrowing it. They cannot handle cooperativeness. The job of higher education is to supply a society with the catalysts it needs to foster high trust, high cooperativeness, and institutions in the middle which foster the generation of a modern condition. I do not believe that the world generally understands the significance of higher education's role in that developmental process, and that much more needs to be coordinated and spoken and told the world about what we do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, great questions. Let me take the platform question first. This may rile some of you, but you know, some of academic freedom's greatest beneficiaries do it enormous harm. I have a close friend in Middlebury College, Vermont, who introduced a controversial speaker, Charles Murray, last February, and was beaten up by her own students while her fellow faculty members stood by and did nothing to stop it. I mean, I introduced a controversial speaker at CU in the fall, Roger Scruton, who has views on gay equality that I regard as mistaken, morally repellent, but he was entirely competent to speak about the subject I asked him to speak upon. And as soon as he stood up, 25 of my students walked out of the hall rather than listen to him, to express, which is their right, their moral rejection of his position on gay equality and gay identity. In my view, it was a mistake of them to walk out. But it's a free community. If they feel that their identity is so attacked that only a public assertion of that identity and that prevails over their attachment to listening to what they don't want to hear, which seems to be a condition of academic freedom. This is a debate surging through campuses at the moment. But I don't think there's any question that refusing to platform controversial speakers is doing our institutions enormous political harm. I just think there's no question about it. And it then produces a kind of, it produces a sense of us being a closed community that can only bear to listen to certain things. And I say that with care because I've lived through the gay revolution. I've lived through the civil rights revolution. I've lived through the ways in which the society has moved painfully and slowly and after much resistance towards greater equality and decency. And it's a huge human accomplishment, but it's very fragile. It could be reversed at any moment. And I understand how fragile and embattled people feel in their identities. I don't want to deny that either. But I will continue to invite people that my students don't want to hear and my faculty don't want to hear. And sometimes it's political. Sometimes I'm going to invite spokesmen from the Orban government, for example. We've got to keep an open space. And the difficulty for universities is that we need to understand that we are regarded as a validator, a legitimizer of positions. We don't merely provide a space, we validate the person who steps up. And I have to say to people, the fact that I invite a person who has, in my view, repellent views on certain subjects does not constitute authorization of those views. Right? And we have to say that clearly. We have to tell the public what we're doing when we put someone on a platform. So I'm living it, folks, and and we have to talk it through. And there will be disagreements in this room about whether what I said was right. But there we are. We've got to keep talking about it. I can't even. Oh, the question about Hungary. One of the frustrations about being here is in Hungary is that we would like to be in close public policy dialogue with the government, for example. We know stuff about healthcare and the education system. We'd like to sit down with the government bureaucracy and see whether we can help improve a terrible healthcare system and a failing education system. But we're a little toxic at the moment. It's worth your career to sit down with a CEU specialist. So that, I have to tell you, is a real difficulty. We teach with Hungarian universities. Our PhD students teach in Hungarian universities. We share our library with Hungarian institutions. We do constant outreach in the Hungarian language. No matter how difficult, it seems to me crucial to us, to our mission, to be reaching out to the Hungarian community as far as we can. And one key fact in the CEU battle has been that the most important institutional support that we have received was not from Oxford, Cambridge, and Harvard. It was from Corvinus, ELTE, and the local institute, including the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And so we're just incredibly grateful to the amount of support we've had institutionally from our own people, because they're under real pressure. Their budgets are written by the government. They have very little margin of maneuver. They have less resources than we do, and yet they stood up for us. Hugely important, in fact, to the eventual outcome. And then this final, the final more general point, about totalitarian societies. The thing that I find so interesting about Turkey, Russia, Hungary, China, is that they're not only not totalitarian, but they're not closed societies. One of the most interesting aspects of all of these societies is the ways in which, remember Albert Hirschman's, exit, voice, and loyalty? All these societies allow exit. If you don't like China and you're worried about the security of your assets, you offshore them in an apartment in Vancouver. If you've made a pact with the Yeltsin, the Putin regime, but you're a little uncertain whether your property will be secure, you go to the London property market. To a degree that we're just beginning to understand, open societies are collusive in the stabilization of these societies. London is the classic example of that. If you don't have rule of law in Russia, you do have it in the British courts. So your assets are safe from seizure. And the Putin regime understands this deeply. British society is up to its neck, in a collusive relationship with an authoritarian regime. Now, these authoritarian regimes, China, Russia, Turkey, all these things, are making the gamble that because they're not totalitarian, because they have just enough exit rights, just enough voice rights, they can innovate. They can produce the trust and cohesiveness that you describe. So they've learned from the totalitarian example not to close, not to be autarkic, A-U-T-A-R-K-I-C, but to be open into the global capitalist economy. And what they've then discovered is that it's a tremendous stabilizer, right? So I don't predict any of these regimes are going to fall anytime soon, and one of the reasons is London, Paris, Berlin, New York, right? That's one of the dirty secrets that we have to think about. We are collusive in the stabilization of the authoritarian resurgence in the Western world. Who would have thunk it?
Next round of 3 questions. Lady in black here, gentleman with a red tie, and there's a gentleman in black or dark blue.
Hello, my name is Walter from the University of Hong Kong. I would like to pick a bit on the first question by Paul Arschwin, but give it a bit of a different spin. In terms of the engagement of universities with society. You mentioned, and to some extent I agree with you, that our importance, our relevance in society is self-evident. I think for us it's self-evident. I disagree that it's self-evident for most of the population. And I'm from Portugal, and I remember during the financial crisis, number one, for a really long time, we didn't have a single academic really coming to the main media saying, okay, this is what's going on and this is what we have to do. And when they were invited, they were using such jargon that probably 0.1% of the population actually understood what they were saying, and they didn't give any hope. They didn't give, look, for the common citizen, what I would recommend is this or that. No. They protect themselves, saying, well, this is a very complex situation, and went in circles. So how, for the common citizen, will you say, okay, look, we matter, if there's no propositions, there's no help?
Yeah.
There's just this academic discourse in which we communicate quite well, which is understood by our peers. So we're very good at scientific communication. We're not good at civic communication, I think. I would like to have your take on that. Thanks.
Lady in black in front of grey.
Yes, hi, Rebecca Chandler, UCL IOE. At the beginning of your talk, you brought up the point about the need to globalize the curriculum, and I completely agree with that. But I wanted to sort of push back on one of the reasons why I think that's been so difficult. That's largely because the voices we still listen to and the voices we still put in our curriculum come from certain countries and come from certain institutions within those countries. And although we have diversity maybe within those institutions, there's still one intellectual tradition coming through that. And in fact, we're all complicit in that. I was struck with your comment about elites from Hungary coming to London. Well, in fact, the elites from Ghana and Kenya are coming to Hungary. And the universities that could have benefited from those students are struggling as well. So I guess that's what I want to push on. That in order to globalize the curriculum, we're going to need to welcome intellectual traditions, thoughts from institutions that are not high up in the global stratification, in the global hierarchy. But those are often from societies that don't have the characteristics that you're outlining. So what do we do with that? When we feel that an institution is in a home that does not have academic freedom, that does not have all of the benefits we think need to happen in order for good scholarship to come through, how do we, as a global community, listen to individual voices from within those contexts that may be worth listening to, even when the institutional home is not what we might want it to be?
Thank you. And the gentleman in the red tie, and then I think, Michael, if you're happy, we'll take one final round of 3 questions afterwards.
Great question.
Thank you for having respected some empty time of silence. My name is Giulio Marini. I'm from CGHE as well, from this place, IOE. I think to some extent you have already answered to the question I had in my after your speech, but I would like to make it anyway. What do you think about the possibilities of China establishing or improving its role, its geopolitical role in this century, having such an open question about academic freedom, especially in the humanities? Okay?
Again, three great questions. Very sharply focused question about civic communication and why we're so useless. It's worse than that we talk jargon. It's that the very few academic economists predicted the crash. That is, we got this highly mathematized, super fancy academic profession, which is the most scientific of all our social sciences, and with some honorable exceptions, it didn't see the dashboard flashing yellow, didn't get the message to the policymakers didn't act, and we went over the cliff, and ordinary citizens look at that and think, what the hell's going on? I thought you guys knew what's happening, and I use guys advisedly, right? So there's that problem. What then follows is a good deal of well-earned humility, it seems to me, about the predictive capacity of the social sciences. And the issue about civic communication is I've lived this because I used to be on British television. And I'm rather proud of the fact that I did programs that had such low audiences that you couldn't get them on the oscilloscope. They were down there in a zone you couldn't measure because they were on it, They were on at 1 a.m, me talking to Leszek Kolakowski, So it was just box office madness, right? But the point being that British television sustained that kind of stuff into the early 90s, and it's just inconceivable now. It had a public education mandate that simply began to disappear in the mid-90s and will never return, to the relief of many, but to the sadness of a few who rather like being up in a carpet warehouse at 3 a.m. talking to European intellectuals. But I learned one lesson about the civic communication is, yes, we got to get out of the jargon, but we have nothing but condescending ways of doing that. We talk down, we simplify. You poor children don't understand. I'm about to tell you something very fancy about, right? We've got to just rethink it, rethink ourselves. I'm a citizen here. I know something. I don't know everything, but I know something. Here's the most important thing you need to know from 25 years of scholarship and thinking. So that's rule one. You don't talk down, you don't simplify, you conceive yourself as a citizen trying to help other citizens in a situation of equality, all right? Second thing, and that's a huge temptation for intellectuals in the media, you allow your own expertise to be corrupted. You go into a television studio and they ask you about the economic crisis, and then they say, who's going to win the football game on Saturday? And you say, well, I like, do you know what I mean? You get lured into talking about stuff that you know squat about. And one of the things that produces huge popular resentment, entirely justified, is a bunch of privileged academics talking down to people about their lives. A lot of it happened post-Brexit. People who never spent actually a day in Sunderland trotted out their data on Sunderland to explain why the poor, benighted people in Sunderland voted the way they did. And the people in Sunderland thought, who the hell is this person talking about me, right? It's not just humility, it's a sophisticated understanding of how the audience will think about what you're about to say and the limits that your expertise properly confine you to. And there's some wonderful communicators. Let's not just focus on the negative. I mean, I could sit and watch David Attenborough talk forever, the greatest public communicator ever, right? Because he only talks about what he knows. He sits there and he talks about whales and fishes and plants and blah, blah, and he listens carefully and respectfully to the natural scientists who work in this field, and he delights in taking their knowledge out. So there's some really great examples out there of great communicators, but we've mostly screwed it up because of these mistakes. We claim more than we should, and we keep talking down, and that's got to stop. And we do the point is we don't merely embarrass ourselves, we do our institutions enormous damage. That's the point. We have an institutional responsibility not to make it worse for our colleagues, and we often do. So that's one thing. The globalization of curriculum question is a wonderful question. I have two ways in which I've seen globalization of curriculum occur. One of them is as a classroom teacher, teaching human rights. Instead of teaching the human rights of gay equality, I had the 4 students in my class who happened to be from Jamaica teach the students exactly why gay equality is such a difficult issue in Jamaica and why there's such resistance. There's religious resistance. There are cultures of masculinity that make it in Jamaica a difficult issue. They taught the class. You just flip it around, work with your students, get them to force a different perspective. Many of us are globalizing our curriculum every day to the degree that we insist on group presentations by students and get them to take the Western canon or the Western social science and flip it and say, here's how it looks when it's coming from Afghanistan, here's what it looks when it comes from, I've learned more from that than anything. But we've still got a hell of a long way to go because our syllabi are credentialed by Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, UCL, et cetera, and that's the problem you're dealing with. I think a second thing that's going to happen in the next 15, 20 years is we're going to start to do partnerships with universities in the, I hate the phrase, global south. Example, CEU goes to the University of Yangon in Myanmar every month to basically help them, a new university that's been restarted after the transition, to write its statutes relating to academic freedom. And they're university governance statutes. Once we do that, we will then start setting up an undergraduate program with them. We'll work it together. They will bring what they have to teach in Myanmar. We will bring stuff. And in those network relations, I think there's the possibility of beginning to create. And then you can see, because of the ways in which blended technologies and stuff, that all of these universities can start to network out so that we teach with the American University of Central Asia, which is a long-term partner of ours. So you get the Kazakh and Kyrgyz view of the world, and believe me, it's very different. We're not using technology at all to make a global classroom, but the minute you start to do that, you can't simply throw Durkheim and Weber at them from dawn to dusk, or Deleuze and Foucault and God knows what, right? You've got to start. They'll learn nothing if it's out, this way and not this way. So, some thought. There was a question about China. I didn't quite know what to do it. I was hoping you wouldn't notice. I don't mean to insult the man in the red tie. I think it follows what I said earlier in answer. That is, Xi Jinping and the regime are making a bet that they can both send, hundreds of thousands of students overseas and have them come back, get PhDs in fancy places, and then come back to highly controlled environments. They think that their social model will continue to be attractive because they're growing at 5-6% a year, and they're building everybody's road and everybody's swimming pool and everybody's infrastructure, while their human model is basically repressive. They're making a historic gamble that Africa, for example, is going to continue to love the fact that the discourse runs like we were never colonizing you in Africa. We regard you as equal. We'll build every road from Nairobi to Mombasa. We will extend your government's loans with no human rights springs. Isn't that wonderful? And then when African people say, well, what about freedom of speech? What about freedom to publish, freedom to think, freedom to dissent? They say, well, we've reached a higher level. We don't need that. Is that going to be a plausible story in Africa in the 21st century? I think it rather condescends to Africa. I'm not sure this model is stable. I'm not sure it's going to be persuasive. And don't mishear me. One of my favorite remarks that Isaiah Berlin always used to quote is Alexander Herzen, the 19th century socialist's wonderful remark to the effect that history has no libretto. I mean, what he was saying is history is not the story of human freedom. Forget that. I'm not telling you that story in disguised form. I don't know how the hell it's going to go. I just think stories that justify tyranny, stories that justify control of freedom of thought are not stories that are going to work. That's a hope. It's not a prediction.
Thank you. We've only got 5 minutes left, so I'll take 2 questions if they're very short, and 3 if the questions are very, very, very short. There's one here. There's one right at the back there. Let's start with those 2.
Hi, William Locke from CGHE based here. Thank you for an inspiring speech and inspiring responses to people's questions as well. I didn't agree with everything, but I felt your pain, but I also felt your spirit and determination as well. Could I ask you about universities as one element of the counter-majoritarian movement, if that's what you call it, perhaps alongside free speech, parliamentary debate, the rule of law in courts, and other aspects. How can those different elements support each other whilst also perhaps challenging the privilege that resides in those places?
And question there.
Thank you very much for the session earlier. Alvin from UCL. Just one question or comment. I think I agree with the notion of freedom in speech of university or whatever you want in this particular topic here. But I get a specific idea that is actually, if put in a nominal value to what freedom is, as in what the West or London or Paris or whatever definition of freedom, and they have used that definition to define or explain what is wrong or what you think is wrong with the systems and higher education in China, Hungary, and Russia, and things like that. So I was wondering if you have actually entertained the idea that actually different degrees of freedom in that case. So I think it goes down to and related heavily to what the state ideologies are, and in the era of limited resources, there has to be some way that we actually, or the state rather, prioritize research and things like that. Thank you.
Okay. And I got 30 seconds, right?
No, you've got 2 minutes.
I think one of the very interesting things about counter-majoritarian institutions around Europe is that they are being attacked socially as bastions of privilege. That is, the attack on the judges in Poland is an attack on the fact that these are very well-paid, spoiled people who are not accountable to the majority will, right? There's an attack on experts. We've had enough experts that, that Brexit stuff. But just behind it is a not so coded resentment at social privilege, at elite privilege, so we're going to have to flip this battle. We're going to have to do 2 things. As I said earlier in the talk, academic freedom is not the privilege of tenured professors. It is a right that guarantees the capacity of a society to have any secure knowledge whatever. And we have to be, we're doing this for you. This is not about my personal privilege as a closed professional caste. We've never really made these arguments as clearly as we need to. We've defined them as corporate privilege, and we've got to go out and say these are integral to democratic freedom, okay? And we haven't done that. I mean, that's my kind of sense of what we have to do there. We also have to criticize ourselves. I mean, it's clear that there's some privileges of academic life that may not be defensible indefinitely. I, for one, have never had tenure in my life. I've had kind of industrial versions, or I've had kind of, we'll let you stay for a while, or, you know, and I definitely don't have tenure at CU. I mean, we gotta think through our hiring and retention policies and how we reconcile giving people the security they need to do great work, but without creating a kind of sense to the outside world that we're defending an absolutely inexcusable kind of entitlement in a world where most of the world lives in deep economic insecurity as a condition of their lives. That's, I think, where the academic freedom, we failed to make an argument. So that's one thing. On the question of degrees of freedom, I'd go some of the way with you. That is, we work with Myanmar. Myanmar is not a free society. It's making a very, very difficult transition. There's got to be give and take in how we dialogue with Myanmar. We can't just say, here are the criteria of academic freedom in Myanmar. You know, let's just forget that, you know, there's the Tatmadaw and the military are hanging over the whole society. No, you have to deal with the society you've got. And so there will be compromises that you make about freedom. But let's be careful here. There is some moment at which the very meaning of the word freedom cannot be qualified. You either have it or you don't. There's a binary on-off character to freedom, which is just a stubborn fact about the idea of freedom itself. All of us make some compromises about our freedom. At my university, I don't get up and use the university platform to abuse Viktor Orban Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. I moderate what I think and say about him. That is a compromise I make for the sake of the institution I'm trying to defend. So yes, there are compromises we make for the sake of institutions. But there's going to be some moment as a researcher, as a thinker, in which you think a thought that you want to express and begin to censor yourself and think, no, I can't do it. And the minute you allow that censorship to happen, you cease to become free in some way that will cost you and cost your society. So yes, freedom depends on context. Yes, you make compromises to safeguard institutions. You abridge your freedom to safeguard institutions. But I think we all sense in our guts there's some moment when you cross a line where you know you've just surrendered your freedom. And that we cannot do. That's what we live for in this place. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.